My name is Dr. Abby. Really excited to be talking about improving well-being for dogs in the shelter environment and particularly what the evidence or what the literature tells us we can do to most effectively intervene to improve welfare. Let's jump right in. Just a quick overview of our roadmap. Just want us to have some shared language or shared definitions. And then we'll talk about how fear, anxiety, and stress can be measured. What causes fear, anxiety, stress, and frustration in the shelter environment? And what impact does that have on dogs? And once we've set that stage, then we can talk a little bit about some of the most important and effective interventions that we can use to give them the best well being during their time in the shelter as possible. We'll talk a little bit about the foundation of meeting needs, some really cool enrichment strategies, what the role of behavior modification or training might be in improving well being, and of course, how we can use medication to support well being while they're in the shelter. So, starting with our definitions, many of you have probably heard this language, particularly if you've done the Fear Free Shelters training. You'll commonly hear FASF as an acronym for fear, anxiety, stress, and frustration. So, just setting the stage a little bit of what these terms mean and why they're important for us to be able to evaluate. Fear is the anticipation or an apprehension associated with the presence of an object, an individual, or a social situation. And so this is something that's actually currently happening to the animal. That's a little bit different than anxiety, where we are anticipating that something bad may happen to us in the future. So the difference between having an object in front of me that makes me feel fearful or a person in front of me that makes me feel fearful versus being anxious that in the future there may be a person or an object in front of me that makes me feel fearful. And then stress, that is the actual physiological or psychological response to either a real or a perceived threat. So you could have stress related to something that makes you feel fearful or anxious or both. So you're hearing a lot of overlap. These terms can be sort of a wild web in that they have a lot of similar manifestations in behavior and in physiological characteristics, which is one of the main reasons why we often talk about them as a group. You'll very rarely hear us talk specifically about fear or anxiety or stress alone. Instead, we recognize them as a tangled web that it can be helpful to evaluate together. And then in the shelter environment specifically, we've added a fourth term here, which is frustration. And frustration is a state that arises when an animal wants to complete a behavior or wants to do something that they're unable to do, whether that is a physical barrier preventing them from performing the behavior or a psychological obstacle. So I think the best example of this we all know in the shelter environment is that a dog is contained by a kennel. There's a stimulus outside the kennel that they see. They really want to explore that stimulus, whether it's a person or perhaps another dog, but they're unable to complete that exploration behavior because they're behind a kennel fence. And so that creates the motivational state of frustration. So in the shelter environment, in this presentation, you'll hear me say a lot, either just stress or FASF. And because that's such a mouthful, just know if I'm talking about one, I'm often talking about them as a group. And really, the goal here of doing these assessments of how much fear, anxiety, stress, or frustration is in a dog's everyday life or shelter experience, we are really trying to identify animals that could use additional support from us to help improve their well-being. So our goal is identify the stress so that we can better support them, better treat them, and ultimately keep them healthier and get them to the right outcome more quickly. So, what causes the shelter environment to sometimes be really stressful for dogs? Like, what are the primary sources of fear, anxiety, stress, and frustration in the shelter? This is by no means an exhaustive list, but lots of evidence that these are contributing factors in the shelter. And the first being everything is new, everything is novel, everything from their food, their space, the people that they're around, the other animals, and particularly their routine. There's also obviously all new sights and odors and lots of sounds. And on top of that, sounds of unfamiliar dogs. And we know that many shelter environments, despite our best efforts to really mitigate how loud it can be, there are often damaging levels of noise. And we know that there's damaging level of noise in many shelters for humans, with dog hearing being even more broad and more sensitive. And so the noise that is happening in shelters is also probably having long-term impacts on the hearing health of dogs. The other thing that can be really challenging for them is isolation. And isolation can look a lot of ways. It can be isolation from people that they know, it can be less contact or isolation just from humans in general. It can be isolation from other animals, whether that's known dogs or unknown dogs. And all of these things culminate into a big picture environment that, from a dog's perspective, is really fairly restricted. They don't have a lot of choice and control. They don't decide when they get to go for a walk, like they might tell you in the home when they're ready to go outside. They don't have a choice and control over that environment, and it can feel very unpredictable to them. And that unpredictability, lack of control, lack of agency and choice in itself can be a stressor for dogs. And it's interesting to note that these are similar stressors that we can see in other species, not just dogs, in similar situations like confinement, whether that be like domestic animals or exotic animals. We see similar pattern. So how might we measure if a dog is feeling stressed? We certainly have physiological parameters that we could use, things like heart rate, things like cortisol. I would suggest that y'all are probably not doing a lot of heart rate and cortisol to measure stress in our average shelter. Instead, what we're using more commonly in our environments is we're looking at behavior. And behavior can have a lot of different components. We could be using body language. So the example here on this slide is the scale of fear, anxiety, stress, and frustration produced by Fear Free. And it gives us images of body language that could help us interpret the level of stress that that dog is currently under. We might also interpret vocalizations. So in the shelter, we know excessive barking can be a sign of stress. We also are looking at things like activity levels, arousal levels, stereotypical behavior. And just as a reminder, stereotypical behavior are behaviors that are repetitive and do not serve any function for the animal. So you may see in shelter environment the pogo stick dog, the dog that is constantly jumping straight up off the floor, up and down, or perhaps the dog that is spinning off the walls, kind of parkour or bouncing off the walls. Those repetitive behaviors are one of our flagship indicators of stress. It is an indicator of an opportunity for us to improve their welfare or their well-being. The other one that's sort of interesting is food and water intake can also give us a sense of how stressed an animal might be. The food piece is pretty intuitive. We've all heard of animals that don't eat their food when they are stressed. But we can have the opposite impact with water and have increased water consumption when we are stressed. Intuitive in the way that if it's because they're aroused or much more active, that would make sense that they may drink more water. But we see this in many other species as well. So an interesting thing that we can also monitor to help us assess the level of FASF or stress an animal is experiencing in the shelter. And the reason it's so important that we're monitoring these well-being parameters or these stress levels and behaviors is that we know that chronic exposure to stressful situations and acute stressful situations can cause both short and long-term impact on animals. That being said, it's highly variable between individuals. We've all seen dogs that live and feel like they're pretty resilient and live successfully in the shelter for many, many, many days and don't seem to really feel much of the effect. But then we all know other dogs that were in the shelter for a relatively short period of time and are already really becoming frustrated, or you'll hear language like kennel crazy. And that is a difference in resiliency skills, most likely. So resiliency is just their ability to adapt and to recover from stressors. So more resilient animals perhaps may cope better in the shelter environment, and that is highly variable between individual. Another interesting theory in the literature that we know is happening in other species, and we have some evidence in dogs as well, is what's called the two-hit model. The idea here is that the animal encounters an initial stressor that sensitizes the stress physiology so that when they're later on exposed to a second stressor, they have a more profound or prolonged stress response. So we see this in people, dogs, and many other animals as well. I think the important application for us as shelter folks is to recognize that their experience in the shelter environment could potentially have unintended long-term effects that follow them into their home and into their behavior for the rest of their life, making it even more important for us to be really good at recognizing and intervening. So some of the examples of potential long and short-term impacts of stressors in the shelter environment. One is really interesting, which is inhibited social behavior. So the duration of shelter stay for dogs impacts their willingness to engage with people and with other animals, particularly if their length of stay in the shelter is long. So that is certainly support for us to try to be moving animals through the sheltering system in a timely manner. We definitely don't want them to become averse to interacting with people or with other dogs because we know that's going to make them harder to adopt. We also see that studies in shelter dogs often are these shelter dogs are taking longer to learn new tasks. So it is impacting their cognition and their ability to learn. It's pretty intuitively pleasing. I think if any of us were having a panic attack, that it could be pretty hard for us to learn some long division. So that certainly makes sense. And similarly, we know that being in a state of high stress means we see increased illness because we're impacting our immune system's ability to protect us from the potential pathogens in the shelter environment. So I won't spend too much time on this image, but really interesting image that was actually made for humans, but something that we believe is likely relevant in dogs is that chronic stress is actually neurotoxic and it's making permanent changes to the physical anatomy of the brain. So what you see in this image is that the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and for memory, actually shrinks when you're in a state of chronic stress. And then we're going to see higher anxiety and more of this fight, flight, freeze response. And at the same time, the part of our brain called the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, is going to get larger. And we're going to see less ability to stay calm, inhibit our memory, and inhibit our focus. That fits well with our understanding of the impact of long-term or chronic stress on cognition and learning. But I think the interesting takeaway here is we could be making permanent changes to the sizes of the parts of the brain that directly affect behavior. So that's an example of long-term impacts of the stress that they could encounter in the shelter. So what does it really look like if we are seeing increased stress in shelter dogs? I think all of you are well familiar with some of these. Certainly you've had a dog in your career where you've seen increased arousal. Often this looks like a dog that is spending a lot of time awake and a lot of time moving around and in sort of a heightened emotional state. Some people feel like this is a state of like being frantic, or you may be having these stereotypical behaviors or running back and forth, lots of barking, potentially at the barrier, and maybe even some aggressive behaviors. We know that food-related aggression, for example, is much more prevalent in the shelter environment than it is in the home environment. So some dogs that show that behavior in the shelter, just as a result of stress, then go into the home and do not continue to show that behavior. So this long-term exposure to stressful environments, we develop these really abnormal and undesirable behaviors. One really interesting study showed that on average, dogs start developing the stereotypical behavior or these repetitive behaviors that don't serve a function after an average of 1 to 13 days. I'll be honest that number was a little bit smaller than I expected, but it fits nicely with our goal of having a length of stay in the shelter of 14 days or less. So if we can keep them in the shelter for less than 14 days, hopefully we are preventing that deterioration, preventing them from getting these high stress states where they show these undesirable behaviors. So that's just setting the foundation on the sources of stress, how we measure and identify FASF, the impact that it has, potentially short-term and long-term. So now let's get into the tofu of the topic, which is shifting our focus to the potential interventions that we can use to really minimize that high stress state and the potential damage that it can cause. So we'll start with the really foundational lens of how do we just meet dogs' basic needs in the shelter environment? And the first thing that we need to look at is their most foundational needs, like making sure they get food and water. Luckily, we have a couple of tools that we can use to help us identify what are the needs of dogs and what is their sort of order of importance. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is an adapted concept specifically for dogs. And what they've done is they've identified 37 needs for dogs and grouped them into 5 levels. And the idea here is that we must first meet the needs at the base of the pyramid or at the bottom before we can really successfully meet the higher levels. And so we see that food and water is the first 2 needs at the bottom of the pyramid. But then we see some other important foundational needs that we need to meet for every animal, like having some exercise and having shelter and basic veterinary care. And then as we go up the pyramid, we have things more related to them feeling safe, their social needs, and then higher level needs as well. So this is one model that we may use to help us understand how we can best meet dogs' needs in the shelter. The other model, which you are probably also familiar with, is called the 5 domains model. This is a newer model that is replacing the 5 freedoms framework, maybe not replacing, but perhaps complementing. The 5 freedoms model focused on animals being free from things that are undesirable. So as an example, it would be free from hunger or thirst. The difference with the 5 domains model is we're instead suggesting if an animal had optimal well-being, what would they have? This is going above and beyond just freedom from things that are undesirable and saying, let's make a list of the things that are desirable to get to an optimal welfare state. So if we are using these models, all of the interventions that we're going to cover are focused on meeting one of the welfare needs in one of these 2 models. But it's good for us to have this framework of recognition of all of the pieces of the puzzle. And I'll share more with you about that here. One of the really foundational needs for all dogs is adequate rest or adequate sleep. So this is something that would be at the bottom of the pyramid. We know it's really core to well-being, just like food, water, and shelter. And in the shelter environment, because of the challenges around noise, around routine, around all of the things that we need to accomplish, it is not uncommon for dogs to be unable to get adequate amounts of rest. And that can look in a couple of different forms. It could be they're just not resting enough hours per day, but it could also be that they're not getting adequate REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. It could also be that they're not sleeping in the most desirable pattern. Dogs are actually biphasic sleepers, and so it is not natural to them to be awake for 12 hours a day and then sleep for 12 hours at night as humans do. Instead, they would be taking frequent small naps throughout the day. And we know that this is really important because there are links between sleep quality and their physical and their psychological well-being. And that's in case in lots of species, including humans as well. And when we're lacking in meeting our sleeping needs, we see increased anxiety, aggression, frustration, poor ability to cope with stressors, so poor resiliency. And that greatly impacts the behavior that we see in shelter dogs. So to give us an idea, this picture is showing us a study where they looked at dogs and the amount of rest that they were getting 30 days before adoption in the shelter environment and 30 days after adoption in the home environment. So we're comparing a single dog, how they were in the shelter, to how that same dog was in the home environment. And it's really interesting that there is less difference between the time spent sleeping for small dogs than there is for big dogs. But for big dogs, there's a 44% difference between the time they spent sleeping when they were in the shelter versus in the home. And I'm sure that you can guess that they slept much, much more in the home. So if you put that into human terms, let's say that your normal sleep schedule is to get about 9 hours of sleep per night. And instead, I asked you to live on 5 hours of sleep per night for prolonged period of time, whether that's a 30-day length of stay or 60 or 90 days, you can imagine how chronically fatigued and irritable and anxious and just generally not well you might feel. So that is what a lot of large dogs are experiencing on average in the shelter environment. So one of the really easy things that we can do that really costs us no money is think about, are our dogs getting 16 hours of quiet and of rest period? And I recognize this is a challenge because we often have 12 hours worth of work to do and still feel like we didn't get enough done. But one of the things you might consider is, can you come in and work for 4 hours and have a 2 hour quiet time in the middle of the day where no one goes through your kennels and you turn off the lights and you play some calming music and we let the dogs rest? And then maybe we need to open it back up in the afternoon. We certainly need to clean and feed our animals. We certainly want the public to see them so they could get adopted. But having that little break time in the middle of the day could potentially be a way to help your animals get more rest and feel better. So similarly to making sure that they get enough sleep, we really have to focus on managing their physical and emotional arousal. This is really important to be able to mitigate undesirable behaviors because we have similar negative effects to physical, emotional, and emotional health if we have prolonged high arousal or high emotional state. The thing that I really want to share with you here is that on average, adopters look at an animal for 20 to 70 seconds. So let's just be generous and say that that's an average of about a minute. So they're looking at a dog for a very, very short period of time. And 27% of people who decided not to adopt a dog at a shelter report that it's because the dog was too active. So think about the dogs in your shelter. If I was to spend 60 seconds looking at each one, how many of them would be jumping up and down, bouncing off the walls, really, really active, seeming really wild? And could a quarter of people be choosing not to adopt because of that high arousal state? So addressing arousal, ensuring that animals are able to relax adequately, really could potentially change adopter perception and increase the adoption. So a lot of the interventions that we're going to talk about are really focused on facilitating sleep and managing arousal. So that way we know that we're still able to move the animals through the system as efficiently as possible, but also really meeting their needs. So our first bucket, besides meeting needs and ensuring adequate rest and sleep, our first bucket of really active interventions is enrichment. We have lots of data on enrichment. We know that it can reduce all of the stress behaviors that we talked about, even stereotypical behaviors, these jumping behaviors, barking behaviors. And we know that some enrichment can help facilitate relaxation and actually improve cognitive abilities. So the graph you see here is a really interesting study. We're using an enrichment item even during feeding and cleaning time in the morning, which tends to be a really active and very stressful and arousing time for dogs. When enrichment was given during that time, there was a 31% decrease in vocalizations. So this is great for the dogs, but this is also good for the people. So we'll talk about some different types of enrichment, but we also want to use it strategically during times and types of enrichment that really meet our goals and meet our needs. So we can broadly divide our enrichment interventions into two categories. Things that are more calming, so things that may facilitate low arousal or things that facilitate relaxation, or things that may be more arousing. This isn't to say that one is better than the other. It is just important to recognize what is the best thing for this animal, what is my goal with this enrichment, and can I pick an enrichment activity that best helps me achieve that goal? So some examples of calming, very intuitive, a frozen Kong, a nylabone, so things that are going to encourage restful chewing. It may be quiet time in an office with a person. We have some scents like lavender and chamomile that can be great calming enrichment, as well as music. On the other hand, some of these same categories can also be arousing. So toys can also be a form of arousing enrichment, like chasing a frisbee would certainly be an arousing enrichment toy, or even some scents like rabbit urine or dog interaction. It could potentially be arousing intervention. The next graph that you see here at the bottom of the screen shows us that if we continue to track vocalizations, that the calming enrichment caused the most decrease in vocalizations. But interestingly enough, even some of the quote arousing enrichment items decreased vocalizations when compared to the animals that got nothing. So that helps us know that even an arousing activity or an arousing enrichment item may be better than no enrichment item. But if we're really aiming to reduce arousal, which is the goal for a lot of our big dogs in the shelter, the calming enrichment category is really our big gun tool to focus on. So just wanted to show you a couple fun toy options and tell you what the literature shares about how we make the use of toys as enrichment the most effective. The biggest takeaway for you here is that toys really need to be rotated. So it is great if you have a nylabone or some type of nylabone toy or chew in every kennel. If you can add a rotation of those items to your kennel, even if you change them every other day, that can make a really big difference. On average, dogs engage with toys somewhere between 3 and 8% of the time observed in the research. And initially, this sounds like kind of a low number, but this is pretty similar when you account for their number of waking hours. This is pretty similar to us reading for an hour a day. So that's actually pretty significant. An hour of reading a day could be really beneficial and calming for a human. And so this level of engagement with toys could also be really beneficial for dogs. So think creatively about the types of toys that you have so you can have a lot of variety and do a lot of rotation. Nylabones are certainly really popular, and in one study, the nylabones were preferred over various types of balls and squeaky toys and tug ropes. So a strong preference from dogs for nylabones. And interestingly, in another study, dogs preferred stuffed toys over hard toys. So that's something certainly to consider, particularly if you're getting them donated, let your dogs shred some stuffed toys. And if you're able to add a scent to the toy, that could increase the time that they engage with the toy. So things like lavender, chamomile, animal urine, all of those things can be really fun to help increase their engagement with the toy and hopefully exponentiate its benefit. So here's just a sample schedule for you. And the great thing about enrichment is you can start anywhere, even if you have limited budget, even if you have limited supplies, even if you have limited time, which I know we all do. Make yourself a schedule. Start with one item 3 days a week. Just start small, start what works for you. And give it during the morning if you can, when there's the chaos of cleaning. And then engage volunteers to slowly build up the complexity of your program. In a perfect world, every dog would get multiple different enrichment opportunities every day on top of the opportunity to leave their kennel. But you got to start where you are, start somewhere, and then just slowly build up over time. The good news is volunteers love this. Anyone can sit and stuff Kongs for you. Shout out to the folks at Wisconsin Humane who have this image here where they have a stainless steel bowl filled with some type of either wet food or kibble that's been moistened. And they've got the frozen Kong and the tire and the hard toy all frozen into that food. So this is an enrichment opportunity that will probably be several hours for that dog, which is great, calming, low arousal, brain stimulating, engaging activity. And if you haven't experimented with scents, get some lavender oil and get yourself a spray bottle of water, some drops of lavender, and you can spray many different things with lavender. And that's a great calming scent, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that you can put on blankets or toys. Stuffed toys are a great option for that. That can be good for calming enrichment in the morning during cleaning. This shows you some great work up at Gigi's where they've got their big, huge buckets of frozen Kongs, frozen puzzle feeders, frozen different food types in stainless steel bowls, these giant, giant meatballs. How fun for the summer. I get it. If you don't have 100 extra Kongs sitting around, what about a paper towel tube or a toilet paper tube? Put a donation box or a box in your restroom and ask people to collect the paper towel or toilet paper tubes, and just have your volunteers put their regular kibble in it. That is a great way to offer them some enrichment with their regular food and really no extra cost to you. And of course, I'm sure you've all seen the Frisbees. You can buy the cheapest Frisbees on Amazon, hit them with a drill, hang them with a carabiner or a zip tie. And whatever you put on the Frisbee, you can also freeze so that it takes more time. There is nothing more rewarding than walking into a kennel of a bunch of dogs that are always barking, and all you hear is the Frisbees clicking against the cage because everybody's licking their Frisbee. Really, really, really fun way to get volunteers engaged and help keep the dogs happy and calm. So our next form of enrichment is human interaction. Interestingly, we do have some data to show that when given a choice between interacting with another dog or with a human, that most dogs, the vast majority, will prefer social interaction or to be within proximity of a human. So obviously dogs have a long history of domestication. And so as a result, it's innately important to them to have time with people. And they show more excitement to gain access to people than they do to dogs. So there are lots of ways that we can measure the benefit of human interaction, but we know overall that it does reduce stress. And even in some of our physiological parameters like cortisol and blood pressure and heart rate variability. I will say, though, one of the things that we really want to note is that the type of interaction between the dog and the human does matter. So we've seen benefit in the research from play between human and dog being beneficial. We've seen research where petting interactions between humans and dogs have been beneficial. And in one really interesting study, they initially had dogs have petting sessions with a variety of people, including both men and women. And they saw benefit of the session as far as stress in the dog when the dogs interacted with a woman, but they didn't see the same benefit in men. And they thought that was really interesting. So they went back and compared how women and men were interacting with dogs. And they found out it was a little bit different. And so they taught the men to interact with the dogs the same way that the women did. And then when they retested it, they saw the same benefit. So that just shows that using things like a soothing tone of voice, like being really positive in the way we interact, is impacting whether it's beneficial at all or not. The other thing that is really important for us to think about is that the goal of the enrichment. So if the goal of the enrichment or the human interaction is to decrease arousal, we want to choose activities that are calm. And so this often will mean a location away from the commotion of the shelter environment. I mentioned that because there are programs where people can go into the kennels with the dogs. It's not to say that has no benefit, but it would actually have more benefit if the dog left its kennel and went to a quiet room with a person or went outside and sat by a quiet tree in the parking lot. Getting away from that commotion and hustle and bustle of the shelter is far more beneficial time used. The other thing that's really important for us to note is that if the interaction with the human includes anything that the animal perceives as punishment, we do see increased cortisol. So not all human interaction is equal. It needs to really be, from the dog's perspective, a positive interaction. And we have to remember that punishment is in the eye of the beholder. So what one dog thinks is punishment might not be something that another dog is sensitive about. And so being able to read their body language and really adjust as we're going through the interaction can be really helpful to optimize the benefit. So in addition to human interactions, of course, dog interactions are another form of enrichment. And one example is co-housing. There is some mixed results in the literature around the benefits of co-housing. And that's probably because there's a lot of individual variation. For some dogs, co-housing is beneficial, and for some dogs, that's probably not what they would choose. So overall, though, if we are very carefully matching dogs to ensure that they're a dog that enjoys being co-housed and to making sure they enjoy the other dog in which they're co-housed with, if we can make those really productive matches, then we do see a trend of a decrease in a lot of stress behaviors. One thing we have to be careful, though, is we also see increased activity. And we mentioned that managing arousal is really important, getting enough sleep is really important. We really need to think carefully about the trade off here that if we co house and it means that we're compromising rest time or sleep or that we're more active or aroused, we need to make sure that that's a worthwhile trade. And that could be very different from shelter A from shelter B. If your dogs are able to rest undisturbed for 16 hours a day, then this might not be problematic to have an increase in activity. But if you have activity in your kennels for 10 or 12 hours a day, then the dogs are probably already really having a significant sleep deficit. This may not be as helpful for as many dogs. Always individual variation. The other thing to just keep in mind is that the more dogs that we try to house in the same space, it becomes increasingly difficult to ensure that that's beneficial for all of the dogs involved. So in general, keeping it at 2 dogs and not more than that, of course, with the exception of litters of puppies. But if we're talking about adult dogs or even juvenile dogs, keeping it really at 2 dogs is probably the most optimal approach in the vast majority of cases. Another form of dog interaction that can be really helpful is playgroup. The thing to remember about playgroup is that there are different approaches to playgroup, and we do have some data that the approaches may have different impact. That doesn't mean that there's not a time, place, or space for each approach, but it is helpful for us to know that if we're going to put our time and resources into playgroup, how can we make it as beneficial as possible? So if we're to look at this study here, this study looked at 4 groups of dogs. They looked at a group of large play groups that used corrections. They looked at small play groups that used corrections. They looked at a group that did small play groups that only used positive reinforcement. And then they looked at a control group. And they compared the mean cortisol level of the dogs in all of these groups. The group with the least cortisol, which we all know is a stress hormone, was the small play groups that used positive reinforcement. So that suggests to us that the way that we get the most benefit from play groups with the least stress is to do these 3 dog or less play groups that are only using positive reinforcement. And interestingly, the lowest cortisol was maintained over 7 days. And so that is an interesting finding that this is having an ongoing benefit, an ongoing impact for several days. So in summary here, like, can playgroups be helpful? Absolutely, but how we do it matters. So the next form of enrichment that we can think about, and I found some really fun pictures here when I was making this slide for y'all, is environmental complexity. And one of the levers in this category that we can use in the shelter pretty easily is cage furniture or habitat decor, however you want to term it or label it. We know that having an elevated bed or an elevated resting place is really beneficial for dogs. Also included in the Association of Shelter Veterinarians guidelines that depicts for us the ideal setup for a kennel for a dog. We know we really want them to have that 2-compartment housing, and in the bedroom compartment, having this elevated resting place with a blanket as a comfort item is really ideal. But we can certainly go beyond beds, things like steps or places to hide. So in these pictures, you see this little dog has this kennel to cozy in and hide, which is just giving him more choices in his environment. And then this middle photo is my favorite. This is actually a cat litter box hiding den that people would keep in their home. And it's serving not as a litter box, but as a place for a dog to be able to go inside and hide. And bonus points, this dog can also get on top of it. And so he also has an elevated platform where he can lay. We do have some literature about what do dogs do if they have access to a platform or to a kennel. And in one study, dogs spent over 50% of the time that they were observed on the platform. So that suggests that this is a really fun choice to be able to give dogs. And of course, we want to use things that we're able to sanitize or to replace. And so I also like that in this image, they have something that looks like we could definitely spray it down with our rescue solution and make sure that we're maintaining biosecurity when the next dog gets access to that. So think creatively. Can you give these transport carriers to more dogs? Does every dog have a bed? Can we use some of these hiding dens specifically for dogs that are really fearful? That can be beneficial, but even for other dogs, that can be a great way to just give them choice and control. Moving right along, let's talk a little bit about music and about olfactory enrichment. So music is up first, and we have in the literature a lot of research around the impact of music on all species, or many species, I should say, including dogs. And one of the things that we found is that classical music specifically can be really calming for dogs. And I love using Through a Dog's Ear. It's free on Spotify and lots of other platforms. But if you read the history of how this was designed, it's very interesting. Someone that's an expert in the psychology of acoustics in humans helped design classical music, primarily what we would consider classical music, that has a calming effect on dogs. And they did test this in the shelter environment as well. And it was calming for over 70% of dogs, right down to heart rate. We're seeing decreased heart rate, decreased respiratory rate, and increased relaxation, which again, often our goal in the shelter environment. On the other hand, we have some research that tells us there are types of music that are arousing rather than calming. Probably not a surprise that heavy metal did not increase relaxation for dogs. But even more interestingly, things like pop music or even human conversation were arousing rather than calming. I think this is a really important note because I have certainly worked in places where I left the radio on or I left music on that was not classical music. And I was probably actually just adding to the noise and the arousal when really I was trying to be calming. And so the takeaway for us here is if our intent is calming, which is typically what we need with enrichment in the shelter, we really need to be using classical music and preferably Through a Dog's Ear so that we really know it works. Spoiler, there is a Through a Cat's Ear as well. So our next form of potential enrichment is scent, and we spoiler this a little bit, talked about it a little bit already, but same theme. There are calming scents that promote relaxation, like lavender and chamomile. And perhaps more surprising to me is there are scents that are more arousing, like peppermint or rosemary. I was surprised to hear that rosemary was a potentially arousing scent, but it certainly makes sense that things like animal urine would be arousing. So again, what is the goal of our enrichment and what of our enrichment options best meet that goal? There may be times where an arousing scent could be really fun and engaging for a dog that is not otherwise over aroused. And this can be really fun to experiment with. You can buy, if you haven't before, you can buy over the counter many different animal urines and spray it, dilute it and spray it onto enrichment items. Even if you want to spray it on a paper towel tube or a cardboard box, it's really, really fun for dogs. So another form of enrichment that is also part of meeting needs is exercise. And I'm not going to belabor this one because we all know that dogs need exercise as a foundational component of their health. I think the questions that are important to me around exercise is, do we have dogs that are getting plenty of exercise because they're so aroused and they're standing, running, barking, jumping a lot during the day? So do they really need more exercise? Is that the treatment that is going to help with their arousal? It is not always better to just exercise a dog until they are like really, really, really tired. If you are already stressed and sleep deprived, like running a marathon is not the thing that you need, right? You want a warm bowl of soup and you're going to curl up on the couch with a blanket. And so I think that if we're going to use exercise as enrichment, it should be because we believe we have already met their sleep and rest needs. We are already managing their arousal well, and adding exercise to their routine will improve their well-being, not further arouse them. Another potential option is that if we're going to use exercise, we follow it with a calming activity. So maybe there's a limited window of exercise. So maybe it is a 5-minute jog and then a 10-minute walk, which is a little lower arousal. And then maybe it's 25 minutes of quiet rest with a person present, sitting in the grass next to a tree where the dog is able to relax and sniff. And then maybe we have a calming enrichment item like a frozen Kong after that. And so we've taken sort of the level of arousal of activities, and as each activity goes on, we're doing something lower and lower and lower arousal so that they return to their kennel with this most low arousal, calm activity. The other thing that is hard to tease out in the literature is the enrichment that has been explored in the literature around exercise often involves a human. And we already know that just being with a person is beneficial. So it's hard for us to tease out, is it the exercise itself or is it just the human time that would be equally beneficial? So it's definitely an area of more research needed. So I'm going to fly through a couple of slides quickly, and then I want to get to some questions for you guys. Just really quick before we talk about behavior modification and training. So we're coming from a shared understanding of what these terms mean. Training is more about teaching a specific skill to a dog that's emotionally healthy. When we think about behavior modification, we're thinking about changing a behavioral or emotional response to a stimuli. So behavior modification, we're most commonly using desensitization and counter conditioning techniques together to gradually expose a dog to a stimulus that elicits a response that we find undesirable. And we're going to pair that with something positive, or teach an incompatible behavior would be a potential example. So how might we use these tools as a form of enrichment in the shelter environment? Well, we already know that any regular human contact is beneficial for a dog if they're living in the shelter. And so by default, training, because it is with a person, will probably show some benefit. However, in general, in the literature, we don't have evidence to support that we have higher adoption rates for dogs that received basic training, and we don't see shorter length of stay in the literature either. So as a result, that poses the question that would we have the same benefit of having Joe Schmo, or someone who does not have any training knowledge, spend time with the dog versus needing a person that is a certified trainer spend time teaching skills to a dog? If one of those things is a lower investment, like just engaging a volunteer, and that has the same benefit as using a trainer, we may choose to just use our resources, right, for that dog rather than to learn sit, to just have human time. And we might expect that they have the same adoption rate and the same length of stay. So just an interesting hypothesis. The other form of enrichment or behavior modification in the shelter, we do not have a lot of evidence or research around how behavior modification can potentially help us in the shelter environment. We know that behavior modification, specifically classical and operant counter conditioning techniques, have positive outcomes outside of the shelter environment, but it is really hard for us to apply that data to the shelter because the animals typically have so much trouble managing stress and arousal. The other question that we ask ourselves often about behavior modification in the shelter is, how much will what we teach that animal in the shelter environment translate into the home? How much of those skills or how much of that progress will they retain when they get out of the shelter? We just really don't have the data to answer that question yet. So I leave that with you to decide how high of a priority is it for us to focus our interventions in these areas. We know not all places can afford a behavior team, and this suggests that that's okay. You can do some of these other enrichment items that we know, or other enrichment interventions that we know have a really high return on investment. These, we're not so sure about how high of a return on investment they have. Quick note for you that we have a lot of evidence that if we are going to use behavior modification and or training in the shelter environment, we need to be really mindful of the methodology that we're using. So we have many studies that show us the evolution of the landmarks of training in behavior modification science over the years. And so this shows us the key methods that were adopted as new science emerged over the last many, many years. And so a couple of the terms here that you may be really familiar with is if we look back to 2005, that's when LIMA, or the least intrusive minimally aversive training approach, was really became popular. That followed later by the 5 domains being published, and now in 2023, we have a new sort of emerging philosophy around training called the LIFE model, which I'll show you a quick slide on here in just a moment. Here we go. Least inhibitive, functionally effective model. And this model is really about increasing choice for animals, assessing what is the function of the behavior that we're trying to change, and using their emotional motivation, their understanding of their emotional motivation from a compassionate approach to do effective behavior modification. And why might this matter? Why might this approach matter? Well, we have a lot of data about different methods of training, and we know that reward-based training improves the ability for animals to learn new tasks. And on the flip side, we know that aversive training can have a lot of negative fallout. So this is sort of a laundry list of studies that have shown us that the potential impacts of aversive training, and that's everything from increasing behavior problems, including aggression, to increasing cortisol, so a physiological hormone that we can actually measure. It can damage the human-animal bond. It is possible for a dog to start associating these aversive experiences with humans and even generalize that to the humans that potentially were not involved in the aversive experience. And we also suspect that it really compromises welfare even outside of the context of training. And the bottom line is there's no evidence that aversive training is more effective than reward-based training. And so if equally effective, but without the possibility of negative long-term or short-term fallout, it feels like the reward-based training approach becomes a really obvious choice for us. So hence the new development of the LIFE model. So last intervention we're going to talk about quickly today, and then I'm going to try to get a couple of questions in from y'all, is how can we use medication as an intervention to improve well-being? We have so much data now about the benefit of behavior medications, particularly in dogs and even in the shelter environment, easily over 50 papers in this bucket. So if you have an opportunity to explore things like trazodone or gabapentin in the shelter, we know that that can treat all sorts of disorders and help them with the confinement of the shelter. It can help make learning easier if needed. It can improve staff safety. But overall, if it makes dogs less aroused, less stressed, improves their well-being, they're going to show better to adopters, and they only have 60 seconds to convince someone to pick them. And so really getting them in that optimal welfare state and minimizing their arousal, if we can facilitate that with medication and it helps them have a shorter length of stay and move through the shelter system and into a home more quickly, then that's a really, really life-saving tool. We could spend, I could spend an easy 8 hours talking to you about medication. We don't have that today, but I just wanted to leave that as a note for you as a potential really important intervention. So if I just wanted to summarize the key takeaways for today, what I would leave you with is the question, what is our goal with our enrichment interventions? What would be the most helpful approach to improve well-being? In many shelters, the answer is probably going to be reducing the level of arousal, providing calming activities, and ensuring the animals are getting enough rest. And the great thing about that is there's a lot of those things we can do for almost no money and potentially for free. It can be as simple as some quiet hours. It could be as simple as playing some through a dog's ear music. It can be as simple as volunteers taking dogs out and spending quiet time with them in a room. Or it can be something a little bit more fun, like putting their regular kibble inside of a paper towel tube and feeding it to them that way. Something that simple can really improve well-being. So start where you are. Start with what you're doing and layer on one intervention at a time. Recruit a volunteer to help support this program. Volunteers will love enrichment programming, and empower them to start layering it on. Tell them the goal is in a few months, we'd like to be doing 2 enrichment items a day. Or if you're already doing 2, bonus points. Let's see if we can do for 3 per day. So I'll stop there and share my email address with you. Like, love to talk more. If you have an awesome enrichment schedule, an innovative idea, cool pictures of the enrichment work you're doing, if you're interested in any of these papers or feel like there's something I really miss, I'd love to talk with you more. So feel free to reach out to me via email. Otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and see if there are any questions for us to answer.
There is one question, Dr. Abby. Did you see it?
I see one about like the resources in a PDF. Is that the one you're looking at?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah. Yes. You can definitely, if you email me, I can send you all of this in the whole deck in a PDF, or the sample enrichment schedule, ChatGPT. That my best friend ChatGPT made that for me with some prompts, but I can share that with you as well. Yes, I can share my email address again. Here. I'm going to type it in the chat for you. So that way, if I'm not sharing, you can see it. Perfect. All right. Wow, I finished on time. I'm shocked. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Please feel free to reach out to me. Love to talk more and really hear what you guys are doing for enrichment. I take so many cool pictures, so many innovative and creative things happening at shelters to help support dogs. And I love being able to take your ideas and share them with other places so we can all learn from each other. So thanks so much.